Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Susan Black. She is the founding partner, principal, and director of Perkins Eastman Black Architects, Inc. And what I want to talk to her about is an architect's role in healthcare facility design, building hospitals during a pandemic. What COVID-19's impact has been on architecture and future design trends, and Women's College Hospital, which is one of her passion projects. What's the example it provides in what we're doing with healthcare today from an architectural standpoint, and then maybe just chat a little bit about Susan Black and her career and her passion and where she sees herself in architecture going. So, Susan Black, how are you? Welcome to our show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, let's take a step back and tell us a little bit about yourself. You are an architect.
I started as an interior designer and went into architecture and did a thesis on the role of the architect on the development of the child in the city, which is something that seems to have stuck with me through all the years.
Really? A thesis on the role of architecture or design on the role
of the architect on the development of the child in the city.
Of the child in the city. So what? The benefit for playgrounds and biking around?
Well, it wasn't just that, because this was a long time ago. This was in the 70s. So I realized that, our architects, we have pretty big egos. It's not our best quality. And certainly we seem to think we can do it all. It's changing a lot in the world today. But I couldn't help but notice that Toronto was growing and growing, but the little people weren't really considered too well. Now, it's a lot better today, but there are a lot of reasons why that's still a good topic. So then fast forward through working for Arthur Erickson and Ron Tom and the greats, actually, learning a lot about design, I went on my own and thought I would do more public architecture, less high-end, highbrow, although to be honest with you, I do love the design end. And then eventually I was asked to do healthcare out of the blue. And I thought, there's no way I can do this. I don't have any experience. I'm up against a lot of people who have, but they wanted somebody who could work with staff and patients. And the first job was Riverdale Hospital, the old Riverdale, which was a scary place.
Yeah, it was.
It was. And there's lots of stories I could tell you there. But then fast forward to another hospital that heard what I was doing there, which was the old Queensway, which became Trillium. And then years later, I started to realize that I wanted to do more for, I thought, specifically children, but Women's College came along and it was something I couldn't put down. My children were born there. I thought it was a brief made in heaven. It was a P3 project to boot. It had a compliance scheme, which was certainly introverted, which I thought was totally against what women should be.
What do you mean a compliance scheme that was in
a P3 public-private partnership project, you have a test case given to you, and then there's a competition. So there are 3 firms shortlisted, and we had to go end to end to fight for the project from a finance point of view, an operational point of view, and from a design point of view. So you look at the compliance scheme and you think, are you just going to go for this and make it a little better and make it cheaper? Or how are you going to win this project? So we threw it out, went back to site plan and did something that was quite different, and it won us the project. So it was extroverted. If you've ever been there, you see this cantilevered pink box, as I call it, and you see curves, you see undulations. Women love it. And really the brief said something that was pretty amazing. It said, we want a whole building because we treat our patients as whole people. And believe it or not, it's not all women. There's about 30% men, often attached to families. But in learning this, women's is not just an ambulatory care center, which is a lot of the way a lot of hospitals are going now, keeping their tertiary and quaternary care quite separate. But this care was based on a lot of research. They have a research institute, which we patriated onto the site. And they really delved into women's circumstances. And it made me quite aware that although my thesis was right on for the child, if you don't deal with the problems that women have, you're not going to help the problems that children have. Now, obviously, in today's world, the two-parent model is still amazing. And oftentimes men fill that role, but more likely it's women who have the issues at stake. So that set me off again, and I kept going. I've done 3 women's hospitals now.
Oh, really? 3?
3, Women's College. Already had done one in Ajman, which was an interesting one with all the cultural pursuits. We'd done a lot of work in the Middle East anyway, but never a bona fide women's hospital.
Where's Ajman?
Ajman is not too far from Dubai, Abu Dhabi area.
Okay.
We had done a hospital in Ras Al Khaimah, which is also in that vicinity. But the interesting thing there was we weren't allowed to talk to one woman. So we had to go on do our own research outside of the hospital and try to figure out what to do and pray that we were hitting the mark. But the other one is just outside Philadelphia, and we just finished that as COVID hit. Literally flew out the end of February, and work that we were supposed to start with them later was curtailed. So COVID really did do a number on most architectural firms, except for those of us who were essential services in healthcare. Right. So, that's kind of, it's tough, but we had to be on site. We had to take the tests. We had to finish the job. So we have work up north, and we have work with Baycrest, and we have all kinds of construction going on. The issue with COVID is that the jobs that were on the table to proceed to follow along behind them have kind of slowed down.
I can imagine. We're chatting tonight with Susan Black, an architect, and we're chatting a little bit about how architecture has changed with COVID, but also more importantly, I think how Susan has been designing healthcare centers and hospitals, particularly for women, and fascinating conversation about her thesis, which was about how to design or architectures can make cities better for kids. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Susan in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having an interesting chat this evening with Susan Black. She's the founding partner, principal, and director of Perkins Eastman Black Architects, Inc. And we're talking about the role of an architect in designing buildings, particularly healthcare facility design, building hospitals, and building hospitals during a pandemic. And I guess, Susan, you were saying that women's college really was one of your passions. And I loved your line about the whole building, and describe again, you said that there's something attached to the side?
In the architecture, actually, there's a huge cantilevered pink box on the building. It's glass. It's it was considered a breakout room this gets more complicated in terms of discussion, but when you get a brief, you get a functional program and multiple programs for a hospital. And there were disparate rooms for meeting rooms and breakouts and whatever all over the place in the brief. So we combined them into a business center or a conference center. And they wanted a theater, but it wasn't together with all the other functions. So that actually is off the atrium. So we took one of the big spaces and cantilevered it on the front of the building into this big, huge pink box, which became their symbol. Their logo was blue and green, and now it's fuchsia and blue and green. So it became their whole branding effort. In fact, right after they were open, they had these amazing posters of all these different patients, and each one of them was holding a pink cube.
A pink
cube? Got it. Yeah, a little pink cube. And they were really fun. They're wonderful images. They did a great job of marketing. So it was kind of interesting to be the designer to produce a building that became part of their branding. It was integral. It also is the heart. It's this conference center. Gosh, you've got some old photos here. Oh, this is COVID photos. Oh my gosh. Anyway, we did a lot with the building that normally you just don't get a chance to in a P3 project. There was a lot of value engineering, but anyway, this pink box, this beacon is like art on the street, and you really know you're at Women's before you see a sign. And years ago, of course, Women's was created because women doctors couldn't get anywhere to learn and anywhere to practice. And women didn't have a dedicated place which caters to their needs to have their children. So that's why it's called Women's College Hospital. So you can see in this very image now there are huge three-dimensional letters that align on the site, which mark the entrance to the old hospital. So the site is heritage, but not the buildings. So now we have a purpose-built hospital for women. So to get to COVID, we recently were working with Women's before COVID hit. They wanted us to design a Genius bar in the atrium. Now,
what's a Genius bar?
Well, we weren't sure at the beginning either. They wanted it pink, fuchsia, the same color as the box. And of course, what it transpired to be was sit right up at the bar and find out how to become a virtual patient.
Right.
How to access the apps. Somebody would teach you, explain what the options were, how you could become a virtual patient. And this was before COVID hit. So of course, COVID did hit and the project was set aside. And now Women's is looking at one of the big trends in the world today, which is creating a whole virtual wing. Whether or not this cool Genius bar will ever get built, it may not need to be, because I think we're all becoming virtual whatevers anyway.
Right.
So virtual care is one of the big deals in the offshoots of it's not a new thing. COVID didn't start it, but certainly it's propelled it. It's been simmering on the back burner and it's becoming a big deal. You might think of it as today you have a waiting room, say, with perhaps 20 chairs, and perhaps that waiting room services one or two departments. Well, during COVID, you didn't have too many patients in that room. They would either the chairs were pulled apart or there were fewer of them, or there were barriers between them. Well, in the future, maybe you don't have that waiting room at all.
Yeah.
Maybe you just have something like a call center where a team has access to all the doctors in the world. You wouldn't even need to have that many specialists at your own hospital, because one specialist could deal with many hospitals. So you design the center, and maybe you design another center somewhere else in the building because it has to be a little more private, because that one has video access into an inpatient room in another hospital, so that a doctor can visit the patient on the screen. Now, it doesn't mean that you never have face-to-face with your doctor ever again, but certainly it helps you have more personal, quick care more quickly than you ever had in the past. So, and also you have access to more specialists, where in the past you might have waited months.
So hospital designs today, you're saying you have to, as an architect, think about not only the building, the bricks and mortar, but how it's going to operate within a virtual digital world.
Absolutely. And of course, we've been doing that. It's not like we've been in the dark ages. We're with our clients on every move. But really, there's two things. We have to cater to their needs and the needs of staff. But when there's a virus, you have to figure out how to do it for the sickest patients and those who need regular care, because you can't let normal healthcare slide because, you know, your hospitals are clogged with every caregiver trying to serve the very sick.
Yeah.
But there's another thing. The neurosciences have proven that the space itself and how you feel in it mirrors your health. So you can't expect to be thriving as a person if you're think of a child living in poverty.
Yeah.
You know, they really have a strike against them, probably because their family has a strike against them. But if you're in a school which has broken windows and terrible facilities, and they obviously different from children who have treed neighborhoods and wonderful parks, you grow up with a complex, an edge, and your health suffers. It's proven, absolutely proven, to the point that your life has less years in it than anyone else. Your life expectancy is low. So architects are beginning to become part of this pledge to do no harm, like doctors, even more seriously than ever before. And I foresee that there will be a fiduciary duty on our part to not make people sick by doing what we can environmentally to make them better.
Right.
And that's the catalyst that Women's College actually put inside me, this urge to see what could be better society, instead of just doing the ego building. I mean, doing a beacon, but still getting on budget is kind of interesting. It says something to everybody who comes, but just spending money for the sake of it may not be what we should be doing. Fortresses to medicine may give way to more people places. And so the other thing that's a big deal is micro hospitals, which are much smaller than women's. It's a trend. It's a bit like an emerge center, you know, catering just to emergency, or a specialty center. But micro hospitals have everything or most of what a big hospital is, only they're dispersed in the community, closer to the community. They could be part of existing buildings, or they could be on small plots of land. They could have just a few beds, or they could have 20 beds. They're a little cheaper to build because they don't have as much high-end infrastructure, but they basically have all the good stuff that a big hospital does. They also use the virtual care because they don't have all the specialists, but they still see patients with various modalities. So this is accelerating again because of COVID, because people are realizing that big centers are not always the best place to treat all people.
Right. And where are you building these?
Well, I'm not building any at the moment because of COVID that slowed down, but certainly we're talking about it with many facilities that have large hospitals like the one in Philadelphia are looking at how to do this. For example, when we finished their women's hospital, it in a sense is like a micro hospital. Right. And we looked at the palette and perhaps how they could use the same palette to do repeats, but for these micro hospitals that were a little more full service. So there aren't many around the world. There's 20 states about have them. There's some in Europe. It's a new thing. It's a new trend. And I think it will take off pretty closely to the near future.
Excellent. So you've talked about building design and how it impacts patients. It impacts the people that are in it. And you've talked about virtual, digital adaptation. You've talked about micro hospitals. What are some of the other trends that you're addressing as an architect or a designer of healthcare facilities?
Modularity is one. For example, we spend countless hours designing an exam room. We just finished a hospital way up north, a mixed community, but it includes 5 indigenous reserves, some of who have to fly in by helicopter. And it's very intensive to do small hospitals like this way out in the wilderness.
Yeah.
But if we could zero in with modular units so that all the exam rooms were a typical design, I mean, there'd be one that's different for casting, one that's different for trauma, but still there would be a sameness, and we could repeat them easily and make them in multiple. It would be a lot cheaper, and it would be easier. It's almost like plug and play. I mean, I'm simplifying, but so hospitals in various areas, even urban cores, could thrive on the multiplicity of pieces of parts instead of having everyone designed uniquely. We did, for example, at Women's, 165 exam rooms. Now, we made them pretty standard, which helps staff, but still, the way the design unraveled on the site, they were all different, slightly different. With modularity, you would do it a lot different. You would design the whole building differently. Washrooms could be modules. And these are available. It's not as if you want a new thing, but there's a lot you can do with that. The other thing is flexibility. And COVID taught us a lot about this as well. I mean, inpatient beds, rooms were changed to be negative pressure isolation rooms. And that's not cheap to do.
Right.
But they needed it for COVID patients, obviously, so that the exhaust would not circulate through the building. I think that there's a better way to do that. And there are mechanical engineers who are looking at that, almost like plug and play again for negative pressure. Knowing that inpatient rooms themselves, we don't normally need as many because we're doing so many services from an ambulatory point of view.
Yep.
But when COVID hits, it's another question. So you move into the hospital and take every place you can. I mean, they're even using gymnasiums.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about sort of surge space that, we've had gymnasiums and I was thinking that, at one of the hospitals I went to, a big conference room had turned into a testing site. So it's almost as if you have to think about surge capacity now, otherwise we're going to be building tents.
Yeah. And we do that with decontam rooms and, for factories that might have an epidemic of something and they're kind of deluging a hospital with whatever, or there's an accident, a chemical accident. But we haven't actually been thinking of surge capacity for viruses. And now we have to.
I think we have to. We're chatting today with Susan Black. She's an architect. She's, it would appear, specialized in healthcare facilities, at least for the last little while. One of her passion projects has been Women's Hospital and how it was changed. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Susan in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. I'm really interested in what Susan Black, an architect with what is it? Perkins. What's the name of the firm? Perkins
Eastman Black Architects.
And Susan Black is one of the founding partners of this firm. Has to say about how our communities, our buildings, our cities are changing. Both, I guess, with COVID-19, but I think you would suggest that you did a thesis a little while ago that suggested they needed to change before that. I found on the internet a quote by you, and maybe I'll share it with everybody, that says that you think that we've got to go back to a concept of communities. And the actual quote said that we need to have a vision to rekindle the longstanding notion of community, wherein families thrive in supportive environments. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean a lot by that. Because I started thinking about children in urban environments, and then the catalyst from for women's health, I realized that a lot of our problems could be solved if, in fact, healthcare was taken closer to the community. But so much of our lives, so many of our lives are connected with technology, but we're losing our interconnectedness with people. Now, COVID really played that up, but we knew that before. It's been happening. I mean, there's research that showed that the fact that communities aren't as strong as they used to be, as in extended kinship, whether it's your own extended family or just extended community, has a lot to do with even travesties like the shootings in the US in schools, or the violence in schools, the mental health and addiction, the family life that seems to have eroded is responsible for a lot of the issues in our lives. So I'm looking at that. I think it behooves architects to really think about our role and how we can help this. And we can't always manufacture the projects that speak to our words, or our words to speak to the projects. But every project we do, we can try to contribute that. So just like this one up north, this hospital, this new emergency and a chemo suite. Well, there's a community that just can't even get chemotherapy without going to Thunder Bay, which is 3.5 hours drive. Easy for somebody that feels well, but not for somebody who's sick. And chemotherapy is not something you would normally attach to an emergency care center. In fact, it could be devastating if you didn't do it properly, so that infection, could go from one to the other. So we had to work with the team and figure out how to service reserves that had to fly in, reserves that are closer, Indigenous populations with mental health problems, including huge meth issues, and do as much as we can for one global $20 million project that had to do whatever we could to make community. In the cities, it's the same. It started out with my thesis. That little child on the street, how do you relate to that child? We keep building monstrosities, but the streetscape is not right in all cases. So COVID hits, and now we have empty buildings. We have corporations that aren't sure they're ever going to fill their buildings again, or all of their buildings. We have people that need housing. We'll always have differences in class. Not everyone is the same intelligence, but we need equal opportunity. We don't always promise equal outcome, but if architects can be part of this in creating environments which create places where community can thrive, we might have a chance right now, because COVID is giving it to us. We can do it in our rural areas, as I just mentioned, but we can also do it in our cities. We can look at not driving on every street. I know that sounds crazy. We can look at more public transit, which I know is music to your ears. Yep. We can look at bringing more trees in. And we have a big deal now with clean energy. If we don't do it, it won't matter what we do for urban or rural areas, because it'll all be too hot to live in. So we have some big problems, but I think we have some huge solutions. And I think that rekindling community should be what we can do to make children's lives a better start, and to make all of our lives more creative, more innovative. And I think our cities could thrive. They're going to get denser, much denser. We got to leave much more green space. We got a quotient that nobody thinks about, that we need green space to people. And all of that has to do with healthcare.
Are city planners, are city politicians hearing what you have to say and adapting? I know of of a development on a major arterial in Toronto that has a secondary plan that limits height. But because of the density, what they ended up doing is building this, I think, ugly, big, huge hulk of a building when they could have built a thinner, higher building that would have been far more beautiful and left some green space and some squares on the corners. And it would appear that the planners are just wedded to their official plans and their secondary plans.
In fairness, there are a lot of great planners in the city. There really are. And there's a lot of bad planners. But there are some near corrupt practices where developers buy their way in and they really get what they want. And unfortunately, that's happened in many places.
How do they buy their way in?
Well, they pay for something on one site to get a density, or they pay to do a park here and they get density somewhere else. And then all of a sudden it's contrary to what the plan had envisioned, but they've already been promised it. There's convoluted deals that are made that make it very difficult. And architects, they want projects, and it's very hard to fight that. We need regulations that don't allow us to do certain things in order to stop that. But the truth is that we will get to a point soon, I believe, with the world the way it is, with our climate the way it is, where it'll become fiduciary duty. Ethics will start to control it, because you'll start to put up a building that hurts the lives of people and you're going to end up in jail. And I hope it pertains to all of us.
Because of what? Because it has too much carbon emissions, or because it?
Well, that too. But I'm more thinking at the moment, you could build a pretty ugly building that doesn't cater to family life or to well-being. And it could be carbon neutral. So, it's got to be all things. I believe that the abuses against the environment are almost mimicked by those against biological sources like people and, of course, animals. And I sound like a tree hugger, and I don't mean to be that off-putting, but I do believe that there is a role for architects to contribute to well-being with neuroscience, understanding the field of epigenetics that proves that our environment makes us sick if it's not a good one, and that planning, as you mentioned, better planning can go so far to making healthy communities. Look at the new community near River Street. They had to tear down everything that was there, full of crime. And now it's a vital community with condos that are worth a lot of money and subsidized housing and rent geared to income, and kids who are playing in great spaces who come from all environments. The same with along the Esplanade in Toronto, where the linear park is. You see every color, every ethnicity playing together. And the school there is a wonderful example of what I'm talking about.
We're chatting tonight with Susan Black, an architect, and we're talking about the trends associated with what's happening with healthcare, what's happening with architecture, what's happening with cities. It's been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.